This is the Bible Book Club.
The Book of Esther.
Welcome to the club.
Last time in chapter 8 of Esther, there was a great reversal of both fortune and power. Everything that Haman boasted about was given to Mordecai. The king took the signet ring he had given to Haman and gave it to Mordecai, along with the power to rule over the kingdom. The king gave Esther Haman's entire estate, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the estate. Then Esther went to work again for her people and begged the king to do something about the death decree. The king gave Esther and Mordecai the power to write a new decree so that the Jews could defend themselves. The decree went out and the people rejoiced. Their world had been turned right side up.
All right, here's the setup for where we are. The day for Haman and Mordecai's edicts to face off has arrived. But before we read the outcome, I want to discuss the controversial wording of both. So, for review, Haman's edict read as follows.
Esther chapter 3, starting in verse 13. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods.
So Haman's edict permitted the Persians to kill all Jews, young, old, women, and children, and seize their possessions. Now, Mordecai's edict read like this.
In Esther chapter 8, starting in verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies.
Now, Mordecai's order permitted the Jews to kill the armed men of any nationality who attacked them, and to kill their women and children, and to seize their property and possessions. The edicts sound the same, but there are some distinct differences. Haman's edict was offensive and unprovoked. It targeted the Jews only for total annihilation. It also provided a financial incentive because if they killed the Jews, they could take their possessions. Mordecai's edict was self-defensive and provoked. They could only kill anyone who attacked them. Now, the Jews legally could take the plunder of those who attacked, but we will find they refused to take plunder from the Persians because this was a holy war to them. Now, where the two edicts are the same is surprising. Both edicts permit the killing of women and children. Why would Mordecai give the Jews permission to kill the women and children of the people who attacked them? It seems barbaric. Well, the scholars give three explanations of why. First, Mordecai's decree had to be a mirror of Haman's to carry the same weight. Lex talionis, or the law of retaliation, was very prevalent in the reversals of this story. For example, Haman is impaled on the gallows intended for Mordecai. So Mordecai's retaliation decree, in effect, made the decrees equal. We can do to you what you can do to us. Second, Mordecai's inclusion of women and children provided a good reason for the Jews' enemies to think twice before attacking, because certainly the women would put more pressure on their husbands to stand down. So the included threat could have helped decrease the attack. Third, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Amalek, which began during Exodus, included a promise from God that he would completely blot out the Amalekites. Haman, the Amalekite, was now dead. He's on those gallows that he built, but his followers remained. Mordecai's decree echoes God's command from 1 Samuel.
which says this in 1 Samuel chapter 15, starting in verse 3. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys.
Saul failed to obey the command, and it cost him the kingdom and the crown. Mordecai and Esther, we have learned, are both from the tribe of Benjamin and are descendants of Kish, the same family as King Saul. Because Saul didn't fully obey, they would know the story, the Amalekites remained a threat to Israel. Centuries later, during the Persian diaspora, Haman, described as an Agagite, likely descended from the king Agag, whom Saul spared, plotted to destroy the Jews. That's the story we're in now. Now, the conflict between Haman and Mordecai is presented in the Book of Esther as a continuation of the ancient Amalekite-Israelite conflict. In the eyes of biblical history, the events in the Book of Esther were a rematch. Mordecai was finishing the job his ancestor Saul had failed to do. Now, the text doesn't describe a complete genocide of all Amalekites. Rather, it's the Jews defending themselves against those who sought to kill them. So we can't be sure that every single Amalekite attacked the Jews and then was counterattacked. However, Mordecai is credited with finishing the mission of the house of Kish, symbolized in the victory of the battle between Haman and Mordecai for power. Well, we can assume that any Amalekite who was considered a threat to the Jews and their families, who could have carried that hatred forward, did not survive. And we will see that there was a substantial number of people who chose to attack the Jews. The alternative, if Haman's plot had succeeded, would have been the annihilation of the Jews, which means Jesus would not have been born and God's plan of redemption would have been thwarted.
You know what else is really interesting about the fact that you said that, like that you just brought up the fact that Mordecai was an ancestor of Saul and he's finishing the work that Saul didn't do. Earlier in this book, we talked about the idea that if Esther didn't step up and do what she needed to do, God was going to accomplish his purpose either way, and he would find somebody else to use. And that's exactly what he did with Mordecai and Saul.
Yeah. All right. Scene 1, the D-Day power shift that no one saw coming.
Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful.
11 months after Haman cast lots of Pur for the fate of the Jews, the D-Day arrives in Persia. But the tables were turned, and the Jews had the upper hand. Not only can the Jews defend themselves, the people of the other nationalities living in Persia were too afraid to attack. The nobles, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators were afraid of Mordecai and actually helped the Jews. And Mordecai had risen to such a place of power that his reputation was known throughout all of Persia. Scene 2, the fall of Haman's house.
Verse 5, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder.
In the capital of Susa, where Haman would have had the most influence in following, the Jews killed 500 men. 10 of whom were the 10 sons of Haman. Not one was left to carry on his legacy of hate. Now, here is a crazy Bible bender about why the names of these sons were so obviously listed here in the Book of Esther. Many scholars believe the author of Esther is making a point that this is a war of good versus evil. In the Persian religion called Zoroastrianism, a deva was originally a god. However, under decrees issued by Persian kings like Xerxes, the deva were reclassified as demons with demonic powers. Haman's sons' names are of special interest because they are thought to be deva names. Since Haman is described as an Agagite in a Persian context, and the devas represent demonic or evil forces in Zoroastrian tradition, there's a correlation. Haman and his sons represent the forces of evil and chaos, deva-like forces, that are ultimately defeated by the forces of good and order, represented by Mordecai and Esther. All right. The description of Haman as an enemy of the Jews, the annihilation of Haman's family, and the fact that no plunder was taken from Haman validate the Jews' perception of this battle as a holy war. Now, one of God's rules for a holy war was that no one would profit personally. The Jews were not fighting on their own behalf, but for the Lord, and the plunder was his, not theirs. Saul kept the best of the Amalekites' possessions and never killed King Agag. The Jews of Susa did not make the same mistake. They succeeded where he failed and didn't take the plunder. Now, the essence of a holy war in the Old Testament is not about Israel versus another nation. It is about God warring against sin and evil on earth. Until the arrival of Jesus, the ultimate warrior and king, God had to protect his people, the Israelites, with both offensive and defensive measures to ensure their existence. With the death of Jesus, the ultimate battle was won. Jesus waged the final war against sin and evil on the cross. Holy war, therefore, takes on a new meaning. The church replaces the army of Israel in the fight against evil in the world. And the battle has moved to the heart, where sin and evil reside. This is why the Apostle Paul instructs us to put on the full armor of God in Ephesians 6:11, because we are the warriors in the battle for the hearts of others. Our battle is not against flesh and blood as it was for the Israelites. Our battle is against the rulers and powers and spiritual forces of evil. Ephesians 6:12. Scene 3. Esther wants more and makes a bold request.
Verse 11, the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened in the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy.
Wow, sweet little Hadassah has become a tough political strategist. The king now looks at his queen, not with desire for her, but with respect and a desire to please her. The king wanted to know what she thought about the report. Was she satisfied? No, she was not. She would like the Jews in Susa to have one more day to fight their enemies. And she wants Haman's sons impaled as he had been. Now, this request seems barbaric, but it was the custom because it sent a message. King Saul and his son Jonathan were actually displayed in the same way. It was a gruesome display with an unforgettable message to all who saw it. Why would Esther be so gruesomely thorough? Well, Esther knows for sure now that she has been positioned for such a time as this. And Esther is not going to look back with regret like Saul probably did. I suspect she had received reports that there were still a few of Haman's followers remaining in the capital. Perhaps they had hung back to see if they could muster a counterattack. We don't know. But Esther was not going to fall short as Saul had. She realized that this was her opportunity to get the Jews back on track. God's ultimate plan for a future Messiah needed Jewish people, her people, and she used the power God had given her judiciously. So there was another day of fighting in the capital, and another 300 men were added to the 500 enemies of God killed in Susa, which validates that she knew there were more remaining and she needed another day of fighting. On top of the 800, 500 plus 300 in the capital, 75,000 were killed in the Persian provinces. In all reports, no plunder was taken by the Jews, and that is stated 3 times. Scene 4, the fast that became a feast.
Verse 18. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other.
So in the capital of Susa, the fighting occurred on both the 13th and 14th of Adar. In the provinces, the fighting occurred only on the 13th. As a result, each had a victory celebration the day after the fighting, with the provinces celebrating after 1 day of fighting on the 14th and the capital of Susa celebrated after 2 days of fighting on the 15th. In just 11 months, the Jews have gone from fasting in fear to feasting in joy. In a book where God was never mentioned, the journey from fasting to feasting becomes itself a witness to God's providence. The Jews' fasting was a prayer, an act of desperation with just a sliver of hope. Their deliverance came through a reversal so unlikely that it points to divine providence, the hand of God working through 2 very unlikely humans, Mordecai and Esther. Scene 5, Purim, a feast to remember.
Verse 20, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants.
Mordecai sends out the first letter about the annual celebration of Purim. Now, we talked about this in the beginning, but the Book of Esther is often called the Book of Banquets or Feasts because there are so many of them. We began with 3 feasts in chapter 1, and then the big power play and reversal happened in between Esther's 2 banquets with Haman and the king. And now we're ending with 2 days of feasts. So what is the Feast of Purim? Well, Mordecai spelled it out. The Feast of Purim was a celebration of the time when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. Joy is actually mentioned 7 times in the last chapters of Esther. And the Feast of Purim is just that, a celebration of joy, because God's divine providence saved them. This feast is perhaps the most joyful of all the feasts and festivals celebrated in the Jewish calendar. And we're going to link our chart of all the feasts and their meanings in the show notes. So why is it called Purim? We talked about this a little bit way back in the overview. The name Purim comes from the word pur, meaning lot. Haman cast lots, like rolling dice, to determine when the Jews would be executed. The lots fell on the 13th of Adar. But God reversed everything. The Jews survived and their enemies were destroyed. So the holiday was named after the very instrument of their doom, transforming it into a symbol of deliverance. It's a final bit of irony. The method Haman used to seal the Jews' fate became the name of their salvation. So how is Purim celebrated today? Well, it starts on the 13th with a fast commemorating Esther's 3-day fast and continues on the 14th of the month of Adar, which this year is like March. There are 4 mitzvot or must-dos to celebrate Purim. The first is the reading of the Megillah, which is the reading of the scroll or Book of Esther. The Book of Esther is read aloud in the synagogue twice, once in the evening on the 13th and once the next morning. Every time the name Haman is mentioned, people boo, stomp, and use noisemakers called graggers to blot out his name and the evil he represents. The second thing they do is giving gifts of food. Based on Esther 9:2, people exchange gift baskets of at least 2 types of food, and they give them to friends and neighbors to build community unity. They also give to the poor. On Purim, everyone must give to at least 2 needy people. The goal is to ensure everyone has enough to celebrate. And then the 4th thing they do is the festive meal. And this meal is held in the afternoon, often with family and friends, and it is a party of joy. There are also some traditions of Purim. First of all, children and people dress up in costumes or masks. This symbolizes how God's hand was masked or hidden throughout the story. Okay, another tradition is this cookie called hamantashen. It is an iconic triangular cookie that represents Haman's 3-cornered hat, and they eat it up. The Purim spiel is a comedic play of the Esther story, and people often rewrite the story of Esther to poke fun at current events and local leaders, keeping the theme of flipping the script. Then the last thing is a drinking custom. There's a famous and often debated saying in the Talmud that one should celebrate until they cannot tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. And that would be probably a lot of drinking. Okay, why do I go through all that? Well, there is a reason Jewish holidays like Purim are important to us too. And I love that about Bible Book Club, that we learn these things, because our heritage as believers is tied up in the heritage of the Jews. The first Christians were Jewish believers. all of the apostles were Jewish. Almost all the books of the Bible were written by Jews. The only exceptions are the two books thought to be written by Luke, and that's the Book of Luke and the Book of Acts, because Luke was a Gentile. Jesus was Jewish. Jesus died on a Jewish holiday, Passover, and rose on another Jewish holiday, the Feast of First Fruits. Again, check the list of our chart of all the feasts and festivals in the show notes. The Holy Spirit came upon Jewish believers on a Jewish holiday, the Feast of Weeks, which we call Pentecost. So bottom line is, without the Jews, there would be no Jesus. Without Jesus, there would be no church. Without Jesus, there would be no redemption for us. The saying, salvation is from the Jews, is 100% accurate. One more unique thing about Purim. It doesn't involve big miracles like the Passover and the parting of the Red Sea. This is why it's so special compared to all the other feasts and festivals. Purim celebrates the small miracles in the form of divine providence. It's God working behind the scenes in the lives of people. These are often seen as a series of coincidences, but they're not. In the story of Esther, God is showing us his hand. Nothing about the redemption of the Jews was a coincidence. Not the king getting drunk and banishing Vashti, not Esther finding favor and winning the queen competition, not Mordecai overhearing the assassination plot against the king, not the king's insomnia and choice of reading material about Mordecai, not Haman's appearance in the court the very next morning and the humiliating parade with Mordecai on the horse, not the timing of Esther's two banquets for the king and Haman, not even the gallows Haman built for himself. This is not a book of coincidences. God is not absent. This book is a lesson in divine providence placed in the Bible for us. The Book of Esther is the story of how God's providence works behind the scenes through the courage and wisdom of faithful individuals to save his people. We talked about that very sentence in the overview and chapter 1. The question for us is this: are you one of those faithful individuals? Is God working through your courage and wisdom to save his people? Can you see him working behind the scenes to put you in positions for such a time as this? Scene 6, the queen has a voice.
Verse 29, so Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim, their designated times as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records.
So Mordecai has already written letters to the provinces about the holiday of Purim, but Esther follows up with letters to confirm the holiday. These letters are described as words of goodwill and assurance. Did the people need assurance? Perhaps that is why they needed to hear from the queen. They needed to be assured that their national status had indeed been raised from the ashes. How the tables have turned. The book of Esther began with Esther and Mordecai hiding their identity. Yet now it states, Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew. She is the queen of Persia, but she is also the daughter of a Jew. And neither she nor Mordecai is hiding their nationality anymore, because it is no longer a source of discrimination. Additionally, the two of them together have full authority. Esther is no longer the unseen queen who must risk her life to approach the king. Esther has a voice, and now she is willing to use it. Think about this. Esther created a religious holiday that still exists today. There is no other woman in the Bible like her. Lastly, The God that the Jews were hiding in Persia is now recognized and revered even by non-Jews. Because of the people God moved into power, the name of God became feared as a powerful protector of his people. And yet his name was not even mentioned once. Scene 7. Mordecai gets the final word.
Esther chapter 10. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all Jews.
So much of the focus in these last chapters has been on Esther, but Mordecai shares equally in this victory of reversals. So the book closes with an epilogue about the king and Mordecai. With Mordecai in charge, the king prospered. The tribute or tax must have improved the economy of Persia because the king's Book of Annals lists acts of power and might. Remember, when he started, he came back from that war from Greece and he was kind of in a bad situation. Not anymore. And Mordecai became preeminent among the Jews. Why? The last phrase of the Book of Esther answers simply.
Because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.
What a contrast he was to Haman. He did work for the good of his people, whether that meant tearing his clothes and making a scene or reporting an assassination attempt against the king. Mordecai's every action was for the good of the people, and the divine providence of God used Mordecai to challenge Esther, unmask Haman, and redirect a foolish and impulsive king. Like Mordecai and Esther, we must trust in the power and presence of God, even when he seems absent and the situation looks impossible. God can work through us and the world in creative and unexpected ways. If you ever need encouragement in a time of trial, or if you ever need hope that the hand of God is working behind the scenes, remember Esther and Mordecai and Proverbs 11.
Proverbs 11, starting in verse 8, the righteous person is rescued from trouble, and it falls on the wicked instead. With their mouths, the godless destroy their neighbors, but through knowledge, the righteous escape. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy.
This verse is perfectly demonstrated by Esther and Mordecai and Haman. Haman fell. God will rescue the righteous as he did Esther and Mordecai. Good will win. Evil will fall. And there will, in the end, be a great feast, a banquet, a celebration of joy.
And that concludes Season 17, the Book of Esther. Join us for Season 18, a very different story in the Book of Job. Don't miss what's next. Hit follow or subscribe so the next chapter lands right in your feed. We've got more Bible benders ahead. And if you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you and all your friends can listen and discuss. New episodes drop every Monday.